Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. This weekend I saw Penguin classics that don't exist but should, and Michael Cavan had great fun with that video. And the response videos have been great. I'll link all of them in the description notes below. Mark over at Book Time with Elvis, Steve Donahue, Drunzo, Sean D. Stanfast. And I realized, you know what? I'm not at home. This is not my house. I don't have access to my library. It's in storage. I don't have a tablet to throw up the cool mock-up Penguin classics covers. But I could, sit down on a proverbial hot seat here and give you my list. So let's start out with Perceforest. Now you may never have heard of Perceforest, but there's quite a few, I think, readers who would really enjoy it if it was translated into English and was published. Now it would be an enormous book. It would either be one of those really huge volumes or it would have to be split up over more than one book. But it's an interesting work. Now there was an 800-page abridgment, yes I did say abridgment, that was published about 10, 11 years ago that had the subtitle, The Prehistory of King Arthur's Britain. And that's because Perceforest manages to connect, the fall of Troy and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar to King Arthur over this massive, sprawling novel that was originally written in French in the 14th century. And the snippets that I've read of it just seem amazing, absolutely outstanding. There are all of these, sort of, because this work is written under the influence of Lancelot Grail, Geoffrey Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, and all sorts of other influences. So he's now, showing that before all of those events happen, there are these dots that sort of lay the seeds for that to happen later on, in this work that he's writing after he's read all these other works. But it's great. There's a precursor to a round table where there's, everybody's fair. There is this, switch from the Druidic religious practices towards a monotheistic practice that ultimately will lead to Arthur and his, Christianity and the quest for the Grail. And so there's all sorts of stuff going on. We have treason, we have an illicit marriage between one of Perceforest's children and a young Roman, which will ultimately lead to a massive battle between Perceforest and Julius Caesar. The Alexander romance is a huge influence, so this is just a wild work. And I think it would be really cool to read. So that's going to be number one. Number two, the novels of Bessie Head. Now you've probably maybe never heard of Bessie Head. She was a writer who was originally from South Africa. She grew up in South Africa as a multiracial woman living under apartheid. And then with her involvement in the Pan-Africanist Congress, she ultimately had to basically flee South Africa as a refugee and with her young son to Botswana, which is where she ended up living most of her adult life and writing all of her works. And her novels are really interesting. I'll have a video on Maru coming up soon. But it would be great if we collected her novels. They're not super long, so you could put like 3 novels together and her stories into a volume, and it wouldn't be a prohibitively large volume. But we have When Rain Clouds Gather from the late 1960s, Maru, which is from 1971, and then A Question of Power, which is where she really gets into, her own. The other books look at life in Botswana, life for a woman in Botswana, life there, and the way in which different African tribes who are now grouped into one single, country with these political boundaries drawn by people who are not from Africa. How do they interact with each other in positive and in negative ways? But her final book, A Question of Power, is really where it starts to get searing and a real interrogation of what's going on. But we also have her collected stories, The Collector of Treasures. So I think that would be outstanding. And that is a work, so Perceforest has never really fully been translated into English, and the abridgment is like $110. The difference with Bessie Head is that these books all were published in English at one point under the Heinemann African Writers Series. Great publishing lineup, but they're all out of print. So Penguin would do a great service if they would bring them back in print. The next one, let's talk about Le Roman Bourgeois by Antoine Furetière. This is from the 17th century. Again, this is a work that has never really been translated in English. It could translate roughly as the bourgeois romance. Sometimes I believe it was called the city romance. This is from the 17th century. And this is sort of a satirical novel. It's roughly like 300 to 400 pages. It's a satirical novel. It's, giving you life in 17th century Paris, but it's also teasing at the different romances and romantic novels that were available and popular at the time. It's making fun of lawyers, probably more in the vein, from what I can understand, of Jonathan Swift than of Charles Dickens and Bleak House, but still, I mean, who doesn't like to, mock lawyers? There's also this whimsical narrator, and this is the feature that I really would be interested in reading in translation, but there's this whimsical narrator who is sort of commenting on and editorializing on the writing of this book and on the narrative. So there's like a preface, as I understand it, comes in the middle of the book, and there's all sorts of commentary that's running along from this narrator. And it just sounds a little bit like Tristram Shandy, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. I'd love to read it. And I would like to have Lydia Davis translate this novel. Another one. How about The Best of Joanna Russ, one of my all-time favorite science fiction writers, a really, really fascinating writer. Part of sort of the new wave of science fiction, an early science fiction writer who was a woman who was very successful, and someone who actually has local connections here. I'm in Tucson, Arizona right now. She spent time here in Tucson as well. But we could, now her works, some of them are in print, some of them are in and out of print, but her works are frequently from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. But it would be great to have Picnic in Paradise. I realize that was in a Library of America volume, so that's not necessarily essential, but The Female Man would be great as well. There are other Alex stories that go in with Picnic on Paradise. The Barbarian is one of the best ones. There would be The Two of Them, which is a really interesting one. That one I believe is totally out of print. Then she has all of her great short stories. I think she had a couple of novels that remain in sort of this corner of the science fiction discourse, but her short stories, a couple of those are fantastic. One of them was in, again, Dangerous Visions, and of course that's When It Changed. But she also has one that frequently gets anthologized in like Lovecraft style Cthulhu mythos anthologies. So there are some really cool stories that could be pulled in as well for this Best of Joanna Russ. And finally, it would be great to get maybe not the whole work, there may not be space for it, and it would be disappointing if there wasn't, but her nonfiction work, How to Suppress Women's Writing, in which she really goes into the different ways, from her own experiences, from the experiences of her colleagues and her friends, and just what she's seeing within the publishing industry of the many ways in which people are working to not promote the writing of women. Right down to well, she didn't write it, or well, she shouldn't have, she wrote it, but she shouldn't have. And those were kind of on the cover of the original book. So Joanna Russ, fantastic writer. Please look her up if you have not yet. All right, let's do another one. Let's do Bustan, or The Orchard by Saadi Shirazi. Now, Penguin Classics has done a pretty nice job of getting more and more classics from Iran or Persia in translation. I think all of them have been done by Dick Davis, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, Attar's Conference of the Birds, Gorgani's Visan Ramin, more recently Nizami's Layli and Majnun. And I think Saadi would be sort of the next step, the next evolution in what has become a very robust lineup. And of course, I think maybe Dick Davis could get this translation. That would be amazing. Now, what would be unique for Saadi is he's a 13th century writer from Iran or Persia, who's coming in a little bit later than some of these other writers, like certainly Ferdowsi or Gorgani. But what also I think separates him from the others is the Shahnameh is this massive epic. It's the Book of Kings. Gorgani and Nizami are very much interested. They write romances or really interesting, strange works that have lessons, but are very much about romance and adventure. Visan Ramin is amazing, but Saadi's a little different. He wants us to understand the way to live a good life. There's a moral aspect to it. There's an ethical aspect to it. Which is a little different, I think, from what the others have produced. And so it would be interesting to sort of add his work. Certainly the Bustan would be the more famous, but the Gulistan would also be cool because that has the Bani Adam. And that's a famous sort of poem or group of statements that I'll read now. This is a very literal translation. The children of Adam are the members of each other, who are in their creation from the same essence. When day and age hurt one of these members, other members will be left to no serenity. If you are unsympathetic to the misery of others, it is not right that they should call you a human being. And that reminds me to a great deal of the famous En Lakesh by Luis Valdes, the sort of translation, his version of a Mayan poem. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love you and respect you, I love and respect myself. And that I think gives you a taste of what, though that's from his other work, that gives you a taste of what could be in the Bustan if that was effectively translated. I think the existing translations on that are like 120, 140 years old. So that would be really cool, again, to get. Let's see. We also need 3 plays by Lynn Nottage. Now, Penguin Classics usually is, a classics lineup. They're publishing stuff that's 25, 55 years old. But every now and then they choose to be bold. Everybody's been mocking the Morrissey autobiography, justifiably. But every now and then they are a little bit bolder. There are works that are from writers who are still alive, works that are, a little bit more recent. And I've enjoyed some of these. So some of their short story collections that they've been pushing out have included stories that are much more recent, and those stories have been really good. So I think it would be great to get 3 plays by Lynn Nottage. Nottage has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for her drama. I think she's among the very tiny handful of really, really great dramatic writers working certainly in the US right now, and it would be really cool to get a volume that had typically the Penguin drama volumes, whether it's Sophocles or Aeschylus or Racine or Ibsen, usually have 3 plays, 3 or 4. Well, we'll go with 3. Of course, we would include Ruined and Sweat, her 2 Pulitzer Prize winning plays, but I think it would be cool to include her very first play, which is set in sort of like it's inspired by the 1950s. It feels like an extension of what Lorraine Hansberry's doing in A Raisin in the Sun, and sort of that generation right after the Harlem Renaissance. What were all of them doing? And so that one is Crumbs from the Table of Joy. I think that one's much harder to find. You can probably find Ruined or Sweat at your library. And I recommend reading them or trying to catch them in performance, but this would be a great way to take, I think, one of the great sort of living writers and Penguin start to, take a risk and be out in front of something, not steal a march on, the Library of America, because I do suspect that Lynn Nottage will be in the Library of America one day. Her character, and I'll add that Lynn Nottage is really good about having her characters interrogate society without it feeling like it's the audience or the reader who the characters are necessarily like speaking to. They're speaking to each other, and we're listening in on that. We're a part of it, and so it allows us to reflect with the characters, and then to hopefully make a change in our own lives from that, rather than feel as if we're being sort of preached at by the characters. So there you go. Let's see. Next one I'll pull out. Let's see. Another one that's got an old translation. The Ocean of the Rivers of Story, sometimes the Ocean of the Streams of Story. And originally in Sanskrit it would be the Katasarit Sagara by Somadeva. This is something else. This would, again, require multiple volumes. Now, Penguin has a Tales from the Katasarit Sagara volume that they published 25 years ago, and it's like 300 pages. Again, this would be a book that would need to be about this big, which would be really cool, in part because it's 18 books of stories, narratives, all wrapped up within this larger frame narrative. And it's part of the reason it's so important to have this work is because it is one of the only sort of recensions or adaptations, revisions that we have of sort of this great lost Indian work. It's usually just called The Great Story from Gunadhya, and that work is lost. There's a couple of versions of what later works that were based on it, and this is probably the strongest of those. Again, I've been able to read just little portions of it, but it would be amazing to be able to read the whole work. Now, there is a translation that's like 140 or 150 years old, and it's really hard to find. And it's also like, using it's affected by the social taboos of the Victorian era. And so if you remember the films where like the husband and wife had the separate beds and stuff, and it was like, what's that about? it's that type of attitude, except even more restrictive. And this is a work where there are characters who interact with each other, and adults who interact with each other in wonderful ways. And so now the real issue is that Sir James Madison was actually working on a translation of this about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, for the Clay Sanskrit Library, but the funding ran out. So he translated the first 2 out of what would have been a 7-volume set. So Penguin could just, get in on this, get those 2 volumes, and then have him translate the rest, and it would be wonderful. And we would, again, we're very close to perhaps, sort of losing Somadeva's masterpiece, and we've already lost Gunadja's. So how cool would it be for Penguin to go in and sort of bring this back to everybody? I think it would be great. All right, next up, we've got the Penguin Book of Central American Poets. Now this is sort of going off of what Penguin has done with some works. There's the Penguin Book of Modern African Poetry, the Penguin Book of Spanish Verse, Penguin Book of Irish Verse, Scottish Verse, Penguin Book of English Verse. I mean, there's all sorts. There's a Penguin Book of Caribbean Verse. And so I'm hopeful that we could get a Penguin Book of Central American Verse or Central American Poetry. And there are plenty of great poets in South America too, but their works are more frequently translated. It would be amazing if there was a volume, Penguin, dedicated to getting into, really great poets from all the different countries in Central America. We could start with Joanna in Mexico, and then just kind of work forward from there. I would include, of course, Ruben Dario, the great sort of modernist. I would include, I think most people would include Octavio Paz, but I would Miguel Angel Asturias, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and I don't know that you could find his work in translation right now. Maria Olimpia de Obaldia. There's plenty of Central American poets. Her works, her very best works, I don't know if they've ever been translated in English. I've read them in Spanish translation and sort of done my own, bowdlerized translation of it into English to try and understand what she's getting to. And it seems very strong. And so it would be really great for Penguin to, I think, dedicate a volume to that. Closing in here, I would include Lumumba Speaks, another work that has been out of print for, I want to say, 50 years, and a work that I think, in terms of nonfiction in the 20th century is one of the critical works, and it's one that's almost impossible to find. I think the volumes, I include this on my Mooks and Gripes bucket list tag, and I'll link that video in the description box, but I think that was a work that you can find copies for $200, $150. I found a copy for cheaper, but it was because the spine had been totally destroyed and I had to rebind it and reglue it myself. But those are the collected speeches and writings of Patrice Lumumba, roughly from 1958 to 1961, and ultimately, his final letters there from prison before he's murdered. And the introduction was by Jean-Paul Sartre. The translation was, I believe, by Helen Lane, and it's very, very powerful work. Again, I think Penguin sort of did this line of Penguin African Classics or something some years ago, and it was really all they did was republish the works of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan novelist who's outstanding, and they were just the Heinemann versions of his works, and they just put them in a Penguin cover and published them. They could do that with all the Heinemann writers, like Bessie Head, but they could also, rescue a work like this, one that has been out of print in the US for years. I think the copies are basically in university libraries. And there are, I think, political reasons for that. There's a great deal of sort of, if folks can ignore that work exists, then they don't have to feel bad about the US involvement in Lumumba's ultimate murder, and the way that nations have worked to destabilize his home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo now, and other African nations. But that's a work that I think it would be great for more people to read it. And finally, my last one, my 10th Penguin classic that should exist but doesn't. And I'm just double checking to make sure I got all of the ones I wanted to talk about. I believe I did, yep. All right, number 10, The Sun Hath Looked Upon Me by Calixte Biala. I keep talking about this because it's the best novel I read this year. Biala is from Cameroon, though she spent much of her adult life in France. And her novels that are set in Cameroon are incredibly powerful. There is a great deal of urgency. There is a great deal of passion about her experiences, the experiences of her friends, of the women in her generation, and a real question around how do we move forward. What is there in life that we should be looking towards and trying to move towards? So if you have not read that book, please check your local library, check local used bookstores, try to find a copy. It's been out of print for, again, 25 years probably, but it is the single best novel I've read this year. An honorable mention would be Hombres sin Mujer by Carlos Montenegro from 1937. It's a Cuban novel. I don't believe it's ever been translated into English. I've read portions of it, again, having to sort of translate it for myself because it's only in Spanish. But the way it begins, it's set in prison, and it has a character who's basically like violently stretching his arms and legs. He's getting a cigarette, and the first word of dialogue is animal, and the second one is horse. And it's just like the way that there's almost this nihilism that seems to run through the opening of that book. Just seems incredible, and it's set in prison. It does deal with some of the characters are queer, and so I think again that would be a work that it would be interesting to have this work that's 90 years old. Penguin could sort of rescue this in the way that they did Claude McKay's Romance in Marseille. So I did not mention all of the great works that do exist in other non-Penguin Classics editions that are like readily available, with the exception of like Lynn Nottage's plays. I think it's really cool that the University of Chicago Press published Journey to the West by Wu Cheng-en, or that David Todd Roy translated The Plum and Golden Vase for the University of Princeton Press. Like, I think that's great. Margaret Sayers Payton and all the translations she did for the University of Texas Press. Like, I have nothing against those presses. I hope that they continue to make bold choices that, push forward what we can expect from university presses, what we can expect from Penguin Classics. It would be great for all of those to be in Penguin Classics, but I don't want to cast any aspersions on those university presses. They're doing good work, and Penguin could take a cue from them on that regard. So let me know. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what your list would be. Hopefully there are more response videos coming up. Thanks.